Henry Kissinger starts raving and ranting. His secretary listens to him. She tells her boyfriend drops off his shirts at the laundry. And the guy that runs the laundry said, hey, I just got it straight from the president. That's where an awful lot of that stuff comes from. And unfortunately, we had more than enough of that in the Watergate.
You mentioned the hope of America, and I intend that electing a born-again Christian, it needs to be in the hearts of the people. Tell us about your own experience. Was it the shock of what happened to you that caused you, I gather that you feel that you're a born-again Christian from your book. What was that? What caused you to change?
Well, I had succeeded at everything I ever tried to do in life. And I drove very hard to get to the top. Clark, I had an office immediately next to the President of the United States. I thought I really had life made. I didn't think I was involved in Watergate. And when I left the White House, I wanted to leave. I'd been there 4 years, 3.5 years. After the 1972 election, I wanted to leave to go back to my law practice and have more time with my family. And I had a very successful law practice. Limousine waiting for me, a friend of the president. I really was on the top, the place I'd always dreamed from having grown up in a little town in Massachusetts in the Depression years, with no money and scholarships to college. I had gotten really to where I wanted to get in life. And for reasons I couldn't then understand, I felt a tremendous deadness inside, an emptiness. And then, I thought, well, I'm tired. I figured it was fatigue, but months went by and I continued to feel it. And then I met a friend whom I had not seen in 4 years. He was a fellow just like myself. He climbed his way to the top, had become the president of a large corporation, 50,000 employees, son of immigrant parents, self-educated, self-made man. It was totally different. I asked him, I said, what's happened to you, Tom? Tom Phillips is his name. And without batting an eye, he said, I've accepted Jesus Christ and committed my life to him. Well, I almost fell off the chair. I had never heard those words. But over those next months in the midst of Watergate, I began to think a lot more about my life, and I met with this friend, and he told me what had happened, what it meant to accept Christ, to really be a Christian. And I studied, prayed. I spent a very tearful night in his driveway, as a matter of fact, one night when I left his house, and made a prayer of commitment in my own life. I have found what a different life it is. Everything about my world collapsed. My law practice was in trouble. My friend, President Nixon, was in trouble. I, for the first time, was threatened with an indictment. I decided to plead guilty in order to put the Watergate behind me. There's something actually I hadn't been charged with. But I look back now and I consider everything in my life, the glamour, the prestige, the money, the power, so-called power, as just lost compared with what it really means to know Christ in a personal way.
I'd be interested in the transformation. When it happened to you?
It's August of 1973 when I prayed to receive Christ into my life. And
were you in prison at the time?
Oh, no. This was before I thought I was going to be a Watergate defendant. As a matter of fact, Watergate was going on, and it was an ugly time in Washington, but I'd been told by the prosecutors that I wasn't a target of their investigation.
You find it difficult making some people accept the sincerity of your conversion because of the timing of it?
Well, the timing of it isn't in our hands. God determines the timing. And I run into a lot of skepticism, of course, and it doesn't bother me at all because I really don't ever ask anybody to believe me. I mean, I don't say to you, believe me that this is what has happened to me. What I say is if you are curious about it, try it yourself. Find out in your own life if it's real. You don't have to take my word for it. For 2,000 years, millions and millions of people have been finding a personal relationship with the living Christ. You don't need to learn it from Chuck Colson. Try yourself.
As you look back upon your life in the White House, and did you suspicion in any way that Richard Nixon was perhaps losing touch with reality?
No, I never had the slightest thought of that. As a matter of fact, I found him to be an extraordinarily keen, sharp, alert man. I began to see the wear of the presidency on Mr. Nixon right after the 1972 election. Henry Kissinger was traveling back and forth to Paris trying to negotiate an end to the war in Vietnam. And then Henry took a couple of weeks in Palm Springs. Bob Haldeman was gone. I was the only fellow with the president. I was with him every day for long hours during that particular period. And I saw him visibly age. That was the first time I'd seen the presidency wear on him. And it was the exhaustion of the end of Vietnam And it put him in a very bad way for Watergate, which was then to come on immediately. You know, the Vietnam Peace Agreement was January 23rd, and then the roof fell in on Watergate. He just wasn't ready for it. I have read all those tapes, listened to several of them, had a lot of conversations with the president during that period myself. He was not himself. He just was exhausted from Vietnam. He was not as decisive as he normally was, but I always found him fully in control of his faculties. I never saw him drink to excess, as were some of the stories that came out. He couldn't figure out what was happening, nor could any of us. You know, what's bizarre about Watergate is everybody says, well, all that awful corruption was going on. And I always have fun by saying, what? And nobody can identify it. You know, it's just sort of a big image of a lot of wrongdoing. But when you're in the middle of it, you couldn't see it all. You know, you only knew what you knew. Nixon only knew what he knew. Haldeman only knew what he knew. Later, with the urban hearings, you put it all together, and yeah, it's a big conspiracy, but you can't see it when you're in it. But I didn't think Nixon had anything to do with it.
Did you know that you were being recorded on the tapes?
No.
What was your feeling when you first found out?
Well,
that maybe you might have said something that, you know, could involve you deeply.
Well, no, I was overjoyed, and I did a little dance around my office because I had told the prosecutors that the day after the Watergate break-in, I had told Mr. Nixon that we should fire whoever was involved and get it out of the White House. And not on any moral grounds. I thought anyone who was stupid enough to have anything to do with the Watergate ought to be fired for incompetence. I mean, it's just a dumb thing to do. And the prosecutors never believed me. After I pleaded guilty, they obtained that tape, and sure enough, that is what I told Mr. Nixon. They never introduced it in the trial. I'm not surprised. Well, I was overjoyed because every conversation I had with the president, he was saying to me that he didn't understand what was happening. And when you're in the middle of one of those things, believe me, it's possible that you don't really realize what's happening.
Well, then you feel that the Watergate episode was a rather stupid, bungled, petty burglary. The bad part, if any, whatever it was the cover-up, wasn't it?
Oh, sure, the cover-up was the fault. I think the Watergate break-in itself was deliberately bungled. I agree with Senator Howard Baker, who has had a lot of reservations about why the Watergate took place. I still don't know why it took place. I think it was more likely a Howard Hughes operation than it was a Republican committee operation. But that's all history. The mistake was lying to the public, which Nixon did, and that's what brought his presidency down. And we can just pray that we've learned something from it. You know, I think Watergate may in the end be a blessing because I think it shatters the false idols of government. You know, in America for too long, we have looked to government to do everything for us, including the reason I'm in Memphis now is to get the community to support a chaplain in the federal prison here. We're being given the opportunity to put a private chaplain in, not paid for by the government. We have come to expect the government to do everything for us, including minister to the spiritual needs of men in prison, that we ourselves as private citizens should be doing ourselves. And Watergate shatters the idols that government can do anything. You know, people worship the government. And Watergate proved that men are fallible, that institutions are fallen, and that we ought to stop putting our faith in government and put our faith in God and God's power working through people, not in government.
Mr. Colson, did you ever hear from Richard Nixon while you were serving in prison? Since you've been out, written your book, appeared on numerous television shows around the nation, you have been in contact with him?
Oh, yeah. He wrote to me while I was in prison on my birthday, and kind of a moving letter. When I got out of prison, I went to California to visit with him. I have seen him as recently as the last 2 months and had a long visit with him in California. I'm not one of those guys who came out of the Watergate and raced around the country pointing fingers at the other people saying, you know, they did it and I didn't. We all did it together. We were kind of like in the Navy, you know, if you're on watch, you're on watch. I was in the Marine Corps. If you got the duty, you got the duty. We all had the duty. And it's the helmsman can't blame the navigator. The ship went aground.
Does he want to talk about it and bring it up, try to clarify and put things in alignment in his mind?
I never discuss the conversations that I've had with him since he left office because.
Well, can you tell us if he has discussed it with you?
If what?
If he has discussed Watergate, the events.
We've had lots of conversations and about lots of things, and he was public property while he was president. I now consider it private property. I don't talk about it. I've tried to help him. I consider him my friend. I've never turned my back on him. And to the extent that I can help him and in fact encourage him because of what's happened in my life, well, I want to be able to do that.
Well, can you tell us this? Does he seem to be mentally and physically better. You remarked how he'd aged so much right after the Vietnam War ended. Does he seem in better shape now that he's out of it all and can relax or do his memoirs or whatever he's doing?
I was very, very impressed last December when I visited with him at how strong he was, how quick his mind was. I had with me one of the men who works with me in the prison ministry that I'm part of, who had been in government and who had preached a sermon at the White House 5 years earlier. Mr. Nixon didn't know he was going to be with me, and I arrived at San Clemente and introduced my friend Fred Rhodes to Mr. Nixon. I said, "Mr. Nixon, you remember Fred Rhodes?" He said, "Of course, you were in the government with us, Fred, and what I'll never forget is that brilliant sermon you preached at the White House." Now, that's remembering something 5 years back when you're confronted with a strange face. The man has an uncanny mind, always has had and does today, and is in good spirit.
Apparently it's difficult at the top to keep your perspective. If that be true, do you feel that there is a need to take a second look at our systems of checks and balances and who has what power, and maybe just overhaul some of the things that systems that we've had going on?
Well, Darren, that's a really good question, because I look at the British system where we have a prime minister, and you also, of course, have a king or a queen. But the prime minister is just another one of the ministers in the government, and he can walk out of his house at Downing Street and across Whitehall and into the Parliament. I was there this year. I told what God had done in my life in the Parliament, to a large gathering of members of Parliament. And the Prime Minister is just another member of the Parliament. And so you don't get the imperial trappings around him. You don't get the feeling of great awe and power, which can distort a man. I pray every day that it will not happen to Jimmy Carter. I know how easy it is. Believe me, I've been there. I know what is yet ahead of Jimmy Carter. And I think the British system has a lot of advantages. On the other hand, I've forgotten who it was that said that what a terrible system American democracy was, but the best in the world, better than any of the others, and it is. For all of our faults and shortcomings, I still think we have the better system. I think President Carter is doing a lot to take away some of the imperial trappings of the presidency, and in this I really salute him.
Does the president's office really have as much power as Mr. Nixon seemed to gather around him, or did he just usurp it and got it by default because nobody called his hand on it?
The power of the presidency is startlingly impotent unless it can provide moral leadership. Moral suasion is a better word than leadership. It's only good. It's the bully pulpit, I guess, as Teddy Roosevelt called it. You can exhort people to do things, but I saw Nixon in great frustration pound the desk because the bureaucracy hadn't given him an executive order he'd asked for 12 months earlier. I think people are deluded by the perceptions of power. They think they're very powerful when they're in Washington. They really aren't. You don't make things happen in the country unless people's hearts change. And the presidency was a great power struggle between the press and, the Watergate was a great power struggle between the press and the presidency and the Congress. But really, none of them have the power they think they have, including the president.
I would be very interested in your comments concerning Jimmy Carter. I think the name of your book, Mr. Colson, is Born Again, and Jimmy Carter certainly has taken his knocks for being declared a born-again Christian. How do you think this is going to affect Jimmy Carter in his presidency and his role of being truly a Christian versus, leading the country?
Well, I believe that they're two separate things. I deeply believe in the separation of church and state, and that a man should fulfill his secular responsibilities when he's elected president for all the people, and we live in a pluralistic society. So he's the president of all people, Jews, atheists, agnostics, Protestants, Catholics. But in his own personal life, President Carter can be a great witness to the rest of the world. When people see him and they see in him the qualities that Christians should be known for, Christ said that the world will know you are my disciples by the love you have for one another. When Carter was saying to Vice President Mondale, as Vice President Mondale was leaving to go around the world, "We love you, Walter." Christians are used to saying that to one another. And just those words and the way he said it is a great demonstration of Christian love in his life. His life can be a witness. And I think he really wants it to be. I've listened to him, of course, at the National Prayer Breakfast, and one of the most beautiful messages I have heard, and I have talked to people who have been praying with Jimmy Carter. And I think he really wants to live the Christian life and be an example. But that doesn't mean that you Christianize the government or that you impose your views on others.
That's the question that comes up on nuclear disarmament, for instance. Is he considering this because of his Christian belief?
Well, if you are a Lutheran, you say you live in two worlds, which is the world of man and the city of God, to use Augustine's phrase. I think he's got to be President of the United States. He's got to do what is in the best interest of the President of the United States. He should never compromise his Christian commitment, but we've got to realize we live in a fallen world and that government is to achieve the minimum of injustice in an unjust society. As President of the United States, he's got to do what is right on nuclear armament questions. As the President of the United States, he may be praying very hard that we can have a lessening of tensions in the world and a peace and a reconciliation that only Christ can bring, but he still has to do his job as president.
Can you tell us a little more about this agreement that you had with Norman Colson, Director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, to have a private sort of chaplain at the new correctional institution, Federal Correctional Institution? Will that be some Memphis minister, or will he be someone that Prison Fellowship will send down, or how will he be obtained?
Well, I'm glad you asked me about it. It's an historic opportunity here in Memphis, because this is the first time, in the federal prison system at least, in which there will not be a government-paid chaplain, but instead will be pastors from outside coming in, and we hope at least one of them will actually live in the prison with the men. I think you can see a revival take place in the prisons of America if you really are in there preaching the gospel and letting your life be a model of what Christ teaches you to be, because other men will want to follow it. And those men are desperate. They live in barbaric, inhumane conditions, violence, carrying knives. I can't tell you the horror of being in the prison. And even though they give a tough exterior, they're hurting inside. They're human beings in the most deprived circumstances and conditions that human beings can live in anywhere in the world. And they hunger for the gospel. The difference in what we're doing in Memphis is an experiment, because never before has anyone been allowed to come in from the outside and be inside that prison, not reporting to the prison administration. In this case, the two men will be reporting to a committee being formed here in Memphis. And we'll be looking to the Memphis community for volunteers and support. But it'll be more like those men are going in as missionaries from the Memphis community to minister inside the prison, rather than the reversal of roles, which is that a fellow is paid by the government, and then he has to come to the community and say, will you please come help get involved in the work going on in the prison? In this way, the community is sending someone in. If it works here, it'll be a great opportunity to see it work in other parts of the country, and I believe it is the answer to the crime rate, which takes a terrible toll in terms of human tragedy and cost. And I think one of the great social impacts of the awakening taking place in America today will be what will happen if we as Christians, and the challenge is on us here in Memphis, to really go in and minister, to bring the gospel in, and to really affect human injustice and crime and punishment, one of the great blots on our society, and to affect it through the power of the gospel as the awakening spreads in America.
Are you going to be specially training these chaplains?
Well, we've trained at Prison Fellowship, which I'm involved with. We've trained over 70 inmates now, who we take out of prisons in the middle of their sentences, and they come and live with us. And we train them, and then they go back in and work in the prisons. We will simply now be training ordained ministers as well. I hope at least one of the pastors will be here from Memphis, and if someone who's watching us feels God calling them, get in touch with us at this station, I would think, and let us know. We will be training the people that go into the prison, either coming here and doing it in Memphis or bringing some people to Washington for training.
How many people are involved in your fellowship?
Oh, it's amazing, really. There are about 10 of us full-time. A lot of us are ex-cons who are working in the Washington operation. Very few of us for salary, mostly volunteers. One man retired from government. Another man I was in prison with, a graduate of one of our training classes, is my secretary, who bright young gal, 25 years old. She cleaned out a bank, did a year in prison, found Christ, and I'll tell you, I've never had a better secretary. And around the country, there are several hundred people who are working with us as volunteers working in prison.
What was the attitude of the other prisoners in the institution where you were toward you as a member of the establishment who had fallen versus one of their own kind?
Well, I became one of their own kind, but you had to work at it. My life was threatened the first week I was in prison. That's not surprising. And for a period of time, people looked at you very suspiciously. I guess they wanted to see if I was going to ask for any special favors. I didn't. Wouldn't have taken any if they'd been offered. And I ended up running a washing machine in the laundry and cleaning handkerchiefs and socks. And after a while, the guys realized I was just like they were. And then they began to come to me with spiritual problems and looking for legal help. I really came to know and love those men in prison. You know, they're just the same as we are. I jokingly say, but there's great truth to it, that the sinners in prison are the sinners who get caught, while the sinners outside are the ones who didn't get caught. And there isn't much else that separates us. I mean, they're human beings. They're in for incredibly trivial things. It's sad how easy it is to end up in prison. Believe me, for the grace of God, it could be anyone.
You think it bespeaks a need for a hard look at our criminal justice system?
There's a tremendous need. By the way, the prisons get all the blame for everything that goes wrong, and they're not to blame. By the time a man gets to the prison, he's been through the ringer. The biggest single problem is disparity of sentencing. You know, you get a guy and one gets cellmates. One man is in for a year for rape, another man is in for 7 years for tax evasion of $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000. And those two guys look at each other and they say, you know, somebody's trying to teach us to be law-abiding citizens when that's the way the system treats us. And that's the biggest problem. That's the judges. The judges have such wide, arbitrary discretion. You get a judge on a bad day, something disagreed with him, he had a fight with his wife, and he puts a guy away for 10 years, and you can't appeal it. So there are many things that half the people in prison are there for problems, offenses committed while under the influence of alcohol. They need to be treated. They're sick, biologically or psychologically. If you put them in prison, they dry out at a cost of $25,000 a year to the taxpayers. It's one figure, 15 another figure. Somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 a year, we put those people in prison. They dry out, go back out, get drunk, commit another offense, and then right up back in prison. The startling figure is that 4 out of 5 crimes committed in America are committed by ex-convicts. And what we're trying to do is to bring the good news of Jesus Christ to them, to help them open themselves to Christ so that their lives can be changed, so that when they go out of prison, they don't repeat their crimes. And I think that the Christian community, and the first opportunity, a really exciting one, is here in Memphis, can do themselves what government and billions of dollars have failed to do. And that is to bring the gospel to people, to change their lives, and that's the only way you're going to change crime. You're never going to be able to legislate it into it. You can only do it when you change people's hearts.
I'd like to go on, but our time is gone. I'd like to thank you for being with us today. Mr. Charles Colson, legal advisor and White House aide to former President Nixon when he was in power, and now an author and a member of Prison Fellowship out of Washington, D.C. Thanks to our panelists, Marge Thrasher of our WHBQ News staff, Clark Porteous of the Press Seminary. I'd like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us today. We'll see you again next week at this same time.
So don't you... Because it's on the call.